You know, when something goes wrong in a hospital, the first thing that pops into your head is why? Was it just a freak accident or did someone mess up? That difference, well, it's everything. And that's what we're going to unpack today. What does medical negligence actually mean when the law gets involved?
So let's put you in this situation for a second. Imagine you go in for what's supposed to be a routine procedure. Super straightforward. But then something goes terribly wrong and you're left with an injury you never expected. The big question in your mind is, was this just a risk I had to take, or did somebody drop the ball? That's the core question we're diving into.
All right, so to figure out how the legal system even begins to answer that question, we're going to walk through what a potential negligence case looks like from start to finish. We'll look at, what you'd have to prove, how doctors fight back, and who in the world gets to make the final call.
So right out of the gate, you hit the first and, honestly, the biggest obstacle. It's not about proving you got hurt. That part's usually pretty obvious. The real challenge is proving that your injury happened because of a failure, a screw-up. And that right there is where the whole legal fight really kicks off.
And here's the really crucial part. All of that responsibility, what lawyers call the burden of proof, it falls squarely on the patient. Yep, you're the one who has to build the entire case, gather the evidence, and prove that the doctor or hospital messed up. And trust me, that is a massive, massive uphill battle.
Okay, but that makes you wonder, right? What about those cases that are just so blatant, they seem to prove themselves? I mean, like a surgeon leaving a sponge inside someone? Come on, does the patient still have to prove every little detail of how that happened? Well, it turns out the law has a very interesting and very specific answer for that.
It's this old Latin phrase, res ipsa loquitur. And what's so cool about this is that it completely flips the script. In these really rare, super obvious cases, the court basically says, look, there's no other way this could have happened without negligence. So suddenly, the burden of proof shifts. Now it's on the doctor to prove that they weren't negligent. It's a total game changer.
And what does res ipsa loquitur mean? It literally translates to, the thing speaks for itself. The injury itself becomes the proof. It's an incredibly powerful idea, but it's really only used for those crystal clear cases where a mistake is just impossible to deny.
Okay, so those speak for themselves cases are pretty rare. What about the rest? What are the most common mistakes that actually end up as negligence claims? This is where we start to see the patterns of where things go wrong.
Now this is probably going to surprise you. When you think of malpractice, you probably picture some dramatic mistake in the operating room, right? But look at this. The data is clear. Diagnostic errors, just getting the diagnosis wrong in the first place, are by far the biggest slice of the pie. It really shows that sometimes it's not the hands-on action, but the thinking and judgment beforehand that's the real issue.
So what do we even mean by diagnostic errors? Well, it's actually a pretty wide umbrella. It can mean the doctor completely missed what was wrong, a total failure to diagnose, or maybe they diagnosed the wrong thing. Or, and this one is huge, they got it right, but just way too late, and that delay caused a ton of damage.
It's also super important to get this next point. Not all errors are legally the same, not even close. Medical negligence is basically about carelessness. Falling below that professional standard of care. Think of it as a mistake, an accident, but one that shouldn't have happened. Criminal negligence, on the other hand, whoa, that is a whole different level. We're talking about a reckless disregard for someone's safety. That's when you know there's a huge risk, but you do it anyway. It's not just a mistake anymore, it's a crime.
All right, so we've been looking at this from the patient's point of view. Let's flip the camera around. How does a doctor or a hospital fight back when they're accused of negligence? Well, their entire defense pretty much boils down to one single core idea.
And that idea is the standard of care. Honestly, if you remember one thing, remember this phrase. It's the absolute heart of every single malpractice case. Here's the key. The law doesn't expect doctors to be perfect superheroes. It just expects them to be competent. So the big legal question isn't, was the result perfect? No, it's, did this doctor do what any other reasonably skilled doctor would have done in that exact same spot?
So that's it. That's the main defense. A doctor's legal team is going to work to prove that their actions, even if the patient had a bad outcome, still met that professional standard of care. They're trying to convince the court, hey, my client did exactly what any other good doctor would have done.
And to really let that sink in, think about what they don't have to prove. They don't have to prove they were 100% perfect or that they made zero mistakes. And they're not trying to prove the patient was at fault. Nope. Their entire case is built on that one single pillar. We met the standard of care.
Okay, so this brings up the next logical and super important question. If this whole thing rides on the standard of care, who decides what that standard even is? I mean, how does a court figure that out?
I mean, think about it for a second. The judge, the jury, they're not brain surgeons. They don't know the ins and outs of oncology. How could they possibly know what a reasonably competent specialist would do? They need help. They need guidance from people who live and breathe this stuff every day.
And that's where expert medical witnesses come in. This is huge. Both sides, the patient and the doctor, will bring in their own qualified experts to look at all the facts and basically explain to the court, here's what the standard of care should have been in this situation.
So what do these experts do? Well, it's pretty systematic. First, they pore over every single medical record, every fact in the case. Then, based on all their years of experience, they form a professional opinion. Did the doctor's actions meet the standard or did they fall below it? It's their testimony that ultimately establishes that standard of care for everyone in the courtroom.
And that really brings us to the single biggest takeaway from all of this. When it all comes down to it, medical negligence isn't decided by some dusty old textbook or a rigid checklist. It's decided by a doctor's own peers. It's about whether other qualified doctors look at what happened and say, yeah, that was a reasonable way to handle things, or nope, that was not okay.
Which leaves us with one last, kind of mind-bending question to think about. If the standard of care is just based on what other doctors are doing right now, how does it ever get better? As medicine moves forward with amazing new tech and treatments, how does this legal standard, this critical benchmark, keep up?